If you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to Hebrews chapter 11. If you haven't been here with us on Wednesday nights, we've been for several weeks now just kind of at a slower pace, just going through this chapter. It's known as the Hall of Fame chapter. You might have heard it called the Hall of Faith, the heroes of the faith. We've been kind of calling it the Hall of Fame as we've walked through it. So tonight is actually our last night on our tour through this biblical Hall of Fame. And I hope it's been as good of an experience for you as it has been for me studying through this chapter, kind of taking just a slower pace at it. I've read it so many times, but never until this study really stopped and kind of walked character by character and looked at each of these. So I hope it's been beneficial to you. If you haven't been with us, you can catch up. You can listen to these messages online, as all of our Sunday morning and Wednesday night messages are posted there on the church app and the website, so you can catch up. But we've learned, as we've looked at each of these characters, really what it means to live a life by faith, to live our life by faith. We've seen men and women who encourage us to do just that. So let me just really quickly sum up kind of what we've learned. Hebrews 11 verse 6 makes it really clear that without faith, we won't see God. Because without faith, we don't please God. The absence of faith results in the absence of the manifest presence of God. We may intellectually know He exists, but we won't experience His existence in our daily lives apart from faith. Faith always shows up in your feet. It shows up in your walk, not just your talk. It's proven to be real when it affects what you do. And each of these characters has exampled that for us. When you choose to obey God, even when it doesn't make sense from a human or rational perspective, that's when you know it's true faith, because you're trusting in who God is and what God has said over what the world tells you or what even your own logic would tell you. Faith always precedes sight. That's why it says at the very first of this chapter, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Once you have sight, it's not faith. If you have to see it first, then you've canceled faith. Faith leads to sight, but most people decide what they're going to do by what they see first. That's our natural tendency. And as a result, we regularly cancel out the supernatural from taking place in our lives because we don't step out in faith, because we wait until we can see it first. How many of you have ever seen an African impala? Anybody ever seen an African impala? Okay. I've never seen one in the wild, but I've seen one at the zoo. I've never had the privilege to travel to Africa to see one of these animals. Anybody seen one actually in its natural habitat in Africa? Anybody? Mike, have you ever seen one? Yeah. So the African impala is really quite an interesting animal. And by the way, when I was a kid growing up, we had a 1984 Chevy Impala. We called it the Bruiser. It was a brownish bruise color, and it was a beast. Two-door Chevy Impala. The doors creaked when you opened them. When you turned the ignition switch off, anybody have a car that ever did this? Like, it kept running and rumbling for like 2 or 3 minutes before the engine finally quit. It was a boat. I mean, it was a beast of a vehicle. And I always hated it when my dad would take me to school and drop me off in the Bruiser, because it was so loud getting out of, right? I mean, you open that door, and everybody that's getting dropped off is like looking at us like, all right. But my parents didn't have a lot of money growing up, and a family had gifted that car to us, and so it was definitely a blessing. But I always thought it was funny that they named that car an Impala, because an Impala is a very beautiful, swift, fast, sleek animal, and the Chevy Impala was just the opposite of that, So whoever named the Chevy Impala, they need to get fired. But I digress, right? But the African Impala is really an incredible animal. They can jump straight up into the air 10 feet high. When they're running, they can make a stride up to 30 feet. So one stride, one leap as they're moving horizontally can be up to 30 feet. But here's the interesting thing about the African Impala. With all of their speed, with all of their beauty, with all of their power, all their ability, if you place them behind a 3-foot tall wall, you'd expect they can jump 10 feet. They can leap 30 feet. Surely, if you put them in a zoo behind a 3-foot tall wall, they could just jump over and escape. You would expect that, right? They could be out of there in no time. Well, wrong. If that wall is solid and they're unable to see through that wall, they'll stay imprisoned there for the rest of their lives. There's one flaw in the African impala. They won't jump where they can't see their feet will land. They won't do it. Their movement is completely limited by their sight. While they're able, they have the ability to get free, they won't exercise that ability because they won't trust what they cannot see. And I think that is somewhat of an illustration for us. In a similar way, we are often naturally the same. We're controlled by our circumstances that we let imprison us behind our own walls of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We want to be able to see before we step out in faith, and that's not faith. That's what the author of Hebrews tells us, right? Faith is the certainty of what is unseen. You know, the devil, I think, uses our circumstances to keep us trapped, knowing that far too many of us will feel the need to be able to see how everything will play out before we ever trust God and His Word and set out in faith. Because faith isn't like that. We can't see. We have to trust and believe what He said and who He is. But by this point in Hebrews 11, I mean, we've seen that, right? I mean, we've gotten that down. You know, you almost get a sense as you read through the chapter. Look with me at verse 32. You almost get a sense that the author of Hebrews is like, he's at that point. Look at what he says. And what more shall I say? Like, you get this tone from the author. It's like he's going, if I haven't convinced you up until this point, I'm not sure anything else I write will convince you. What more can I say to you? I mean, I've written over 31 verses giving example after example of great heroes of the faith and what they were able to achieve by faith. I mean, what else can I say? What more do you need me to write in order for you to get this? If you're not convinced, if you're not motivated by now, then I just need to put a cap on the pen and move on down the road. I mean, you almost sense that tone in verse 32. What more shall I say? It's kind of like the preacher, and I won't name any names, that says, you know, if only I had a little more time, I would tell you so much more. And then he goes on to tell you so much more, right? You ever heard a preacher do that? Goes on with a whole list. And that's actually kind of what happens here, right? I mean, you sense that tone, but then all of a sudden, he goes on for the next 7 verses with more examples. Now, he does speed up a little bit, right? And so we're going to cover all of these in one session. We've spent several sessions because he goes fairly quickly. But he goes on with a list of more people who lived their life by faith. So look with me, verse 32. We're going to read on down to start with through verse 35. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Verse 35, women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. So he goes not into great detail like he did before, but he goes through some more examples, men and women, and their walks by faith. So let me just run through these that he mentioned really quickly. The first one is a very familiar name to us. It's the name Gideon. And if you want to read the story of Gideon, you can go back to Judges chapter 7 and read that. We're not going to take time to do all of that for each of these characters because we don't have the time tonight. But Gideon was a judge, Judges chapter 7. Now, the term judge doesn't mean that they were the ruling president of the nation. They weren't necessarily the top leader of the nation. It just simply means that they were elevated to a place where their leadership and their wisdom put them in a ruling position somewhere in the life and in the land of Israel. So this judge, Gideon, he had to face the Midianites. He was a leader of the Israel army. And so he had to face this Midianite army that the scripture tells us in Judges chapter 7 had 135,000 soldiers, 135,000 men. Now, you remember the story of Gideon. He starts out with an army of his own of 32,000 men. 32,000 versus 135,000. I mean, that's not impossible odds, but it's not real good odds, right? I mean, it's not great. But God comes to Gideon and he says, Gideon, you have way too many men. You have too many men. Gideon, you've got to get the number of your army down. And so he goes through this process to where he finally gets his army down to 300 men. 300. Now that's really not great odds, right? 300 versus 135,000. Now, of course, all military strategy at this point, all human wisdom, all military wisdom would tell you that that's all out the window. I mean, you don't go to battle with 300 versus 135,000 because there is no military strategy by which 300 men can defeat 135,000. So Gideon is completely at the mercy of God. God's brought the number of his army down to 300. So God is going to have to indicate what's the strategy. How are these 300 men going to defeat the 135,000? And God gives Gideon some strange instruction. He tells them to get pitchers, not baseball pitchers, but pitchers to pour out water. And he tells them to get trumpets, and he tells them to get torches, and he says, now go and find this Midianite army. You go and find them. Now, I don't think in history, not that I know of or I have ever read of, has anyone ever fought a battle with simply torches, pitchers, and trumpets. I mean, you might announce the battle with a trumpet, and you might have a torch if you want to protect yourself at night, but that's not how you fight a battle. That's actually an absurd strategy if you're speaking only from human terms. And Gideon, perhaps, if he were thinking the way any normal human being would think, would say, Lord, I'm not going. No way. I'm not taking myself and these 300 men up against this 135,000 men with simply pitchers, trumpets, and torches. Are you kidding me? I mean, you brought my army down to this minimal number. And by the way you did it was you've watched how they drank out of a stream. That's how he eliminated people from this army. This is absurd, God. Why would I ever do this? But if you read the story, Gideon, he never argued with God. He never argued. He never questioned. Why? Well, because his faith was so strong. He understood the odds. I think he understood completely that the potential for his death was 100% on a human level. But you remember what happened. God had them split into 3 groups. Gideon took his 100, and there were a couple of other groups with their 100. And they got to the tops of the hills around where the Midianites were. And they lit their torches, and at the appropriate announcement, they smashed their pitchers, which made a great noise. They revealed their torches, and then they began to blow the trumpets. And the story tells us that the Midianites went into a panic, probably assuming that for every torch, there was an entire division of troops. When it's just one guy with a pitcher and a torch and a trumpet, they go into a panic, thinking that each one of those represents thousands of troops. And so they panic and they roll out of their bunks or off of their pads on the ground and they massacre each other. I mean, it's an absolute slaughter. They turn on one another, thinking that they're fighting this massive number of Israelite troops who had descended upon them. It would be pretty hard to believe God in that setting unless you had a supernatural faith in a supernatural God. So the author of Hebrews highlights Gideon. And then there's Barak. He mentions Barak. I love the story of Barak. This is probably a little less known story, but to me, it's one of the most interesting Bible stories there is. And I want to take you with me to this one. Go to Judges chapter 4. Judges chapter 4, because some of you may not remember the story of Barak, but after you see it, you might remember it. It's one of my favorite stories, probably for some bizarre reasons, but Barak had 10,000 men, and he was going up against the mighty and massive force of Sisera. Now, if you know anything about this story, Sisera was a Canaanite commander, and his army was a chariot army. He had horses and chariots, and so this was like the special forces of this army. I mean, they were swift, they were difficult in battle, and so it was incredible odds also for him. No way to win this battle, but God sent a message to Barak through a woman by the name of Deborah. And Barak believed the message that God sent. Barak believed that God would give him the victory over this chariot army. And so in Judges chapter 4, verse 7, look at what it says. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. This is Deborah, God speaking through the prophetess Deborah. Then verse 8, what does Barak say? He says, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. Basically, he's saying, I want the spokeswoman of the Lord to go with me. She responds to him, and she says in verse 9, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So she says, I'll go with you, but guess what's going to happen? Because you just trusted God, but you needed me, who shared the message, to go with you, the Lord's not going to give you the credit. He's not going to give you, Barak, the glory. In fact, he's going to give Sisera and his armies into the hands of a woman. And of course, as you read on in the story, the victory comes. And it was an incredible victory. Skip down to what I think is one of the most interesting events in this story. Look at verse 15. It says in verse 15, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim. And all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Not a man was left. It says in verse 17, but Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was a peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. She hid him. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, stand at the opening of the tent. And if any man comes and asks you, is anyone here, say no. But look what happens. Look what happens. This is probably the most interesting part to me. Verse 21, but Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. I always found this kind of interesting, right? So she goes into him while he's exhausted, tired. He's now asleep. She goes into him, the scripture says, softly, quietly, sneakily, and she hammers a tent peg through his temple, through his head, and into the ground. And I love the last line of this, because look what it says. So he died. I mean, I guess, right? Somebody hammers a tent peg through your temple, through your head into the ground. I think that would do it, right? So he died. But here's the thing. The author of Hebrews, again, is bringing out this character. This is a small band of almost unarmed infantry that's routing a tank division by faith, because God said it would happen. And so they step out courageously into an unbelievable battle, trusting God. The author of Hebrews is continuing to remind us these were men of faith. He goes on in Hebrews 11. You can jump back there. He goes on and he comes to Samson. And we all know the story of Samson, right? I mean, who doesn't know Samson? Judges 13 to chapter 16. He was Israel's champion against the Philistines. And of course, when you read the Old Testament, the Philistines are one of the primary enemies of God's people. They seem to show up on the scene more than any of the other enemies. And in spite of Samson's stupidity, which he was stupid often, right? He got into a bad relationship with a woman named Delilah. In spite of his tragedy with Delilah, in spite of his loss of strength, this man Samson had years of great, strong faith in God. He recovered from his mistakes, and he demonstrated ultimately great courage and power. This man Samson, the man who had risen to a place of leadership because of his power and strength, he was called by God to conquer the people of God's enemies, the Philistines, and he approached it with incredible courage. He never feared when he entered into battle. He knew that at any point in time, his strength came from the Lord. And there was a symbol of his strength. If you remember, he took a Nazirite vow. His strength wasn't in and of himself, it came from the Lord. And he knew when he went into battle that strength was because of the Lord, not because of him. So he trusted God, and he never feared the enemy that he faced. Now, we see several stories in Judges 13 through 16. We see Samson in anger at the father of his Philistine wife for giving her away to someone else. He ties the tail of 300 foxes together with torches between them, and he turns them loose on the fields, the grain fields of the Philistines, and it burns them all up. And he knew that would irritate the Philistines, right? And again, he's only one man, but he knows that God has given him strength. And since it came from God, it could go away at any point, but he was strong in his faith and in his calling. When the Philistines found out what he had did, and that he was the one who did it, burned their fields, they killed Samson's wife and father-in-law, and he was even more angry. And the scripture says that he smote the Philistines with a great slaughter. I love that word, smote. They tried to retaliate, but he took the jawbone of a donkey, and it says he killed 1,000 of them by himself with just the jawbone of a donkey. They tried to trap him in Gaza, and he just picked up, you remember the city gates, he picked them up post and beam, and he walked up a mountain carrying them. He believed the promise of God, that God had called him to fight for Israel against the Philistines, even against unimaginable odds, one against thousands, even if tens of thousands. It never fazed him. And finally, you remember, after recovering his strength, he goes into the Philistine temple and he brings it all down on top of them. His last courageous act of self-sacrificing faith. He knew his calling. Listen to what Judges chapter 13, verse 5 says. His parents are told, "Behold, this young man," speaking of Samson, "you're going to give birth to a son. You're going to conceive and bring forth a son. No razor will come at his head, for the boy shall be a Nazirite," which means he was going to take a vow of separation to God. "From the womb he shall begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines." So he always knew that when he was walking in his calling, that he would know and experience the power of God. This is faith. This is faith and nothing but faith. And he never flinched in conflict. So the author of Hebrews puts forth Samson as another example. Then fourth, he says Jephthah. Now, this one is also not a well-known character. Most of you probably don't remember who Jephthah is. He's also in the book of Judges, but the story about him is very brief. If you were to look at chapter 11, Judges chapter 11, verse 32, Jephthah crossed over to the sons of Ammon. He crossed over the Jordan River, and Ammon is on the east, and it's where Ammon Jordan is today. And this is the land of the Ammonites. So Jephthah crosses over to the sons of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord gives them into his hand. And he struck them with a very great slaughter, from Aroer to the entrance of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel Keramim. So the sons of Ammon were subdued before the sons of Israel. Another group that was the enemies of God's people, the Amorites, conquered by the courageous faith of Jephthah. And then he goes, the fifth one he mentions is David. It's the next name in the list, David. And we could spend a lot of time, right, on the life of David, because David was up against all kinds of difficult odds in his life. You know, it says in the scripture about David that Saul had killed his thousands, but David killed his 10,000s. David was a courageous general. He was a warrior who fought the fight for the people of God. And his most familiar fight was the one he's most well known for, was a one-on-one battle with what we might consider a human monster, a giant by the name of Goliath. And it comes in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Goliath is just shocked, right? Because David at this point in time, he's not a king, he's not a great warrior, he's a little shepherd boy. And so he'd be shocked that they're sending out this little shepherd boy to fight against him. He's the great warrior of the Philistines, again, God's enemies, the people of God's enemies. And so it says in 1 Samuel 17, verse 43, that Goliath says, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." And then David said to Goliath, the Philistine, probably, I imagine it in a squeaky, just hitting puberty kind of voice, right? "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day, the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I'll give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." I mean, wow, right? Incredible. Would you say that's a lot of moxie for a little shepherd boy who's never been in a battle in his entire life? But we know the end of the story, right? We know it, don't we? It happened when the Philistine rose and came near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. So he's running after it. He's going into this battle full force in faith. David puts his hand into his bag and he takes a stone and he slung it. And believe me, that was a divinely directed stone. I'm sure David was good because he had fought off wild animals while he was protecting the sheep as a shepherd. But there was no way this stone was going to miss, right? Divine providence was involved in this one. And it struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand, so David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, it says that they fled. They must have thought, if a teenage shepherd boy is this powerful, what are the men of this army going to be like when they show up now to take on us? Verse 52 in 1 Samuel 17 says, "The men of Israel arose, shouted, and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and the gates of Ekron," one of the major cities of Philistia. "And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sharaim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, plundered the camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapon in his tent." What in the world would give this young man the courage to do what he did? Well, it was faith in the calling of God. And the author of Hebrews is pointing out once again, this is a man of faith. And look what happened. He couldn't see the outcome, but he trusted the calling of God in his life, and he stepped out in faith. He goes on. Samuel, the sixth character in this section. Samuel. Now, 1 Samuel, we were already there with David. Again, you don't have to turn there, but you can write these down and look at them. Samuel also appears in the first 25 chapters of 1 Samuel, and he dies in verse 1 of chapter 25. Samuel was a great man of faith. He was facing a rebellious people, if you remember. He was facing an idolatrous people. He faced them with the courage of great conviction. He spoke God's word. He didn't think about his own personal protection. He didn't think about his own personal safety. Samuel always said what he believed to be right, no matter what the threat was against him. He was fearless when he warned people. And he warned people, right? Even the high priest Eli. He warned him. He went to him and confronted him with the truth. And then it goes on and it mentions the seventh group. It shifts from just specific individuals to the prophets in verse 32. It mentions the prophets, Samuel and the prophets. And with that one word, the prophets, right? He's been walking, you see that he's been doing this, right? He's been walking through the Old Testament. Started all the way back in Genesis with Cain and Abel and with Abraham, and he's going through the patriarchs, and he's moving his way through the Old Testament story. And so with that one word, the prophets, he covers all the way from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles and the books of history, the period of the kings and the period of the kingdom being divided and unified. And he sweeps all the way through the prophets, all the way to the end of the Old Testament. So he is really going fast, right? He wishes he had more time. He's going quickly now. And you can look here at Hebrews chapter 11, and he just mentions them, right? He just mentions the prophets and takes us all the way to the Old Testament. You might be saying, well, what about the wisdom literature? Well, the wisdom literature, if you remember, it was authored by mostly kings, right? Psalms, mostly by David. Proverbs, Song of Solomon. Ecclesiastes, mostly by Solomon. And so he's skipping that, and he's going straight to the prophets. And he's talking about Malachi and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and he's sweeping across this with this one word about the prophets. And he starts to describe different things. I want you to look at this, right? Because you get no more names now. He doesn't give us any more names, but he gives us experiences. And it's kind of interesting to do. I didn't spend a ton of time here, but I'd encourage you could do this, because as you begin to read through these experiences, your mind goes to some of the prophets. And I think that's what the author of Hebrews is doing. He's not naming them by name, but look at some of these, right? Look at some of these. So he goes in verse 33, the prophets who through their faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. And I think, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I think he's describing various prophets. So just let me give you a couple of examples. For example, shut the mouths of lions. Who's that talking about? Who? Daniel, right? Daniel chapter 6, verse 22 and 23. Daniel obeyed God. When it meant he had to go to the lion's den, he believed God would take care of it and that God would shut the mouths of lions. What about quenched? The violence of fire. Who would that refer to? Who do you think? Also in Daniel, his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we know them, right, by their Babylonian names. They're standing in the fire, and they're not burned. In fact, it tells us there was a companion in the fire, very likely an appearance of Christ himself standing with them. They conquered. They went into the fire, and you remember what they said? We are not going to bow down to you, and if we go into the fire, we'll burn, or maybe we won't burn. But in any case, we won't bow to you. They conquered by faith. They conquered by faith. It could also be said of these heroes, they escaped the edge of the sword. They escaped the edge of the sword. Well, who was that? Well, could be referring to David, right? Wasn't it Saul who was trying to kill him? No matter how often Saul tried to get David's head within the reach of his sword, he could never do it. God protected him. Or David, of course, escaped Goliath and his sword. Or there was Elisha. Could have been Elisha. You remember when he was Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 6, he was being chased by Joram. And he wanted to kill him with his sword, but he couldn't do it. And it says that they were from weakness made strong. Well, who comes to mind there? I think about Hezekiah. He prayed for long life. He prayed for more life. He was a good king. God gave him more life. He had no son. And in a death struggle, he believed God's promise and power. And Hezekiah prayed, and he was healed, and he lived another 15 years. And so it goes through these. I encourage you to kind of do that as you read through these. Think about the stories from the Old Testament that he could be referring to in these. But then we get down to this last section that I haven't read yet. Look at verse 36. Look at verse 36. And I think, honestly, this is the most significant few verses in this entire chapter. He said, others, look what he says, others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. And I love that phrase, of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth, verse 39, and all these, though commended through their faith, they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. He talks about these others. And in verse 38, and it really ought to be in bold and underlined, highlighted in your Bible, these are people of whom the world was not worthy. Isn't that a great statement? I mean, the world was not worthy. The world thought that they were unworthy. The world deemed them unworthy to live, unworthy to be comfortable, unworthy to be affirmed or approved or left alone. The world felt somehow diminished by their presence. But the truth that the author of Hebrews is stating here is that the world was not worthy of them. Why did they go through this kind of treatment? Why did they live this kind of life? Well, they did it because they believed what was in the future waiting for them, a better resurrection, was far greater than anything this life could offer. You look at verse 39, all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. They didn't receive what was promised. They didn't have anything when they left this world in their hands. It was all faith, right? It was all faith. They didn't even know about Christ. I mean, I think they knew about the Messiah that was coming and the promise of the Messiah, but they hadn't even seen the fulfillment of Christ coming. I mean, they knew the prophecies, but they didn't know who he was. He had not come yet. He hadn't walked on this earth. He hadn't died on that cross. He hadn't risen yet from the dead. There was no sight to their faith yet. There was no confirmation that this would ever happen. They simply had to believe God's promise, and they did. And they gained approval, the author of Hebrews says, through their faith, even though in this life they never received what was promised. They never saw it. They never felt it. They never received it in this world. But it was because God had provided something better for us so that apart from us, they wouldn't be made perfect. None of them would have ever been in heaven if it wouldn't have been for what happened later after their lifetimes that we all know about. The cross and the resurrection. The better thing that was coming that they had not yet received was the new covenant. Perfect, the word perfect in the book of Hebrews. We haven't talked about this, but it means saved. It means saved. Perfect means access open and granted to God. Full access to what the old covenant couldn't give. Access into the presence of God both in time and in eternity. They lived by faith in something they couldn't see. They lived, and that's how the chapter's beginning launches it, right? Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The author of Hebrews is saying that's how these great heroes, these Hall of Fame heroes, that's how they lived. Their faith was courageous faith. They conquered in struggling. They continued in struggling. And they counted on a salvation that would be provided in a way that they would never see in their lifetime. Now, I want to close by reading the very first verse of chapter 12. We're not going to continue on in this book. But look at the very first word of chapter 12. He says, therefore. All right, and that's always an important word in the Bible because it tells us there's something else. There's something more. This is not the end of the story. And it's not even really just the beginning of a new chapter, right? What he's about to say is because of everything that's come before. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. Verse 2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, we know who those witnesses are, right? We just met them all the last several weeks and months as we studied through this chapter. And to what do they witness? To what do they witness? They witness to the validity of a life of what? Faith. Faith. And so the author of Hebrews says, therefore, because of all of these witnesses that I've just walked you through, and I wish I had more time to go into them more in detail, but because of all of these witnesses from the beginning of the history of mankind until now, let us lay aside every single encumbrance. Let us lay aside every weight, every sin that clings and entangles us. And he says, let us run with endurance the race set before us. These examples, these characters are models to us that are intended to stimulate our commitment to run the enduring race of faith. That's why he walks through these. And I hope and pray that that's what this series has done for you, to encourage you that no matter what you face, no matter what you receive or don't receive in this life, that you will continue on to run the race of faith that's set before you, remembering those who have gone before, who've modeled it and exampled it, and be encouraged by them.